The morning sun barely peeked through the clouds as Officer James Barrett started his patrol in the wealthy Oak Hills neighborhood. He sat in his police cruiser, sipping his black coffee while his cold eyes scanned the streets. Barrett had been on the force for 12 years, and during that time, he had gained a reputation among his fellow officers, though not the kind anyone should be proud of. At 9:15 a.m., a sleek black Mercedes caught his attention. Behind the wheel was Dr. Michelle Richardson, dressed in her crisp white doctor's coat over a navy blue dress. She was running a few minutes late for her morning rounds at Central Hospital, where she worked as one of the city's top neurosurgeons. But Barrett didn't see a respected doctor. He only saw what his prejudiced mind wanted to see. Well, 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 Barrett muttered to himself, placing his coffee in the holder. Let's see what we have here. He pulled out behind the Mercedes and followed it for 2 blocks before activating his lights and siren. Dr. Richardson checked her rearview mirror, surprised to see the police lights. She was certain she hadn't broken any traffic rules. Being a careful driver was something she took pride in. Still, she did exactly what she knew she was supposed to do. She signaled and pulled over to the right side of the road, in front of a small coffee shop that was just opening for the day. Barrett took his time getting out of his cruiser. He adjusted his belt, straightened his badge, and put on his sunglasses, even though the morning was still cloudy. The way he walked toward the Mercedes showed how much he enjoyed having power over others. Each step was slow and deliberate, his hand resting near his weapon, a completely unnecessary gesture for a simple traffic stop. Inside her car, Dr. Richardson was already prepared. She had her license, registration, and insurance information ready on her lap. Her hospital ID badge was clearly visible on her coat. She kept both hands on the steering wheel, remembering everything her husband had taught her about handling police encounters. License and registration, Barrett barked, not even bothering with a greeting. His tone was harsh, nothing like the professional demeanor officers were supposed to maintain. "Good morning, officer," Dr. Richardson replied calmly, keeping her voice steady despite the officer's rudeness. "May I reach for my documents? Right here on my lap." Barrett made a show of looking annoyed. "Just hurry up," he snapped, watching her every move like she was a threat rather than a professional woman on her way to work. Dr. Richardson slowly handed over her documents. Everything was in perfect order. Her license was current, her insurance was up to date, and her registration was properly filed. She even had her hospital credentials readily available. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Barrett asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "No, officer, I don't," Dr. Richardson answered truthfully. "I was following all traffic laws and maintaining the speed limit." Barrett's face twisted into a smirk. "You ran a stop sign back there," he lied, knowing full well there hadn't been any stop signs on the road she traveled. "Sir, there haven't been any stop signs on this road," Dr. Richardson said politely but firmly. "I drive this route to work every day. I'm very familiar with it." This challenge to his authority, even though it was completely factual, made Barrett's face turn red with anger. He didn't like it when people questioned him, especially not someone he had already decided was beneath him. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his voice growing louder. "Officer, I'm happy to comply, but I'd like to understand why," Dr. Richardson said, maintaining her composure. "I'm already running late for my surgeries at Central Hospital, and I have patients waiting." The coffee shop owner had come outside to set up the morning's sidewalk signs, becoming an unintentional witness to the scene unfolding. A few early morning customers had also started to gather, some discreetly taking out their phones. Barrett's ego was getting more bruised by the second. Here he was, trying to assert his authority, and this woman was calmly asking reasonable questions instead of cowering in fear like he expected. He couldn't stand it. "I said, step out of the vehicle," he shouted, his hand now gripping his belt. "Or do you want to add resisting an officer to your charges?" Dr. Richardson knew this situation was escalating dangerously, but she also knew her rights. She reached for her phone, intending to call her husband, not knowing that this simple action would trigger the next shocking series of events. The moment Dr. Richardson's hand moved toward her phone, Officer Barrett exploded with rage. He yanked open her car door with such force that it bounced back, nearly hitting him. "Hands where I can see them," he screamed, spittle flying from his mouth. "Now you're really asking for trouble." Dr. Richardson kept her movements slow and deliberate. Officer, I'm simply reaching for my phone to call. I don't care what you're reaching for. Barrett cut her off. Get out of the car, now. The small crowd outside the coffee shop had grown larger. Sarah Chen, the coffee shop owner, had stopped pretending to arrange her outdoor signs and was now openly recording everything on her phone. Several customers stood frozen with their coffee cups, watching the scene unfold with horrified expressions. Dr. Richardson carefully unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out of her Mercedes. She stood tall in her professional attire, her white doctor's coat a stark contrast to Barrett's aggressive stance. At 5'6", she was shorter than Barrett, but her dignity made her seem to tower over him. "Officer Barrett," she said, reading his nameplate, "I want to understand what's happening here. There was no stop sign, and I've done nothing wrong. I'm happy to discuss this professionally, but I need to inform my hospital that I'll be delayed." Barrett's face twisted with fury. How dare this woman speak to him like this? How dare she act so calm and collected when he was trying to intimidate her? In his warped mind, her professional demeanor was a challenge to his authority. "Turn around," he barked. "Hands on the car." "I will not," Dr. Richardson replied firmly. "You have no probable cause, and I have done nothing wrong. I'd like to speak to your supervisor." The crowd gasped as Barrett stepped closer, invading her personal space. Some people were now live streaming the incident, their phones held high to capture everything. "You're resisting arrest," Barrett growled, his face inches from hers. "No, Officer Barrett, I'm exercising my rights," Dr. Richardson corrected him calmly. "And everything you're doing is being recorded." That's when it happened. The sound of the slap echoed through the quiet morning street like a gunshot. Barrett's hand had struck Dr. Richardson's face with such force that her head snapped to the side. Her glasses flew off and clattered to the pavement. The crowd erupted in shouts of horror. Sarah Chen dropped her phone in shock, but quickly picked it up again, knowing how important this evidence would be. Cars were stopping now, more people gathering to witness the unfolding situation. Dr. Richardson slowly turned her head back to face Barrett. A red mark was forming on her cheek, but her eyes were steady and unflinching. She hadn't made a sound when he hit her. She hadn't tried to fight back. Instead, she stood perfectly still, her gaze locked onto his badge number. "Officer James Barrett, badge number 6487, she said clearly, her voice carrying to all the witnesses. "You just committed assault against an unarmed civilian who was exercising her constitutional rights. I want every person recording this to note the time, date, and badge number." Barrett's moment of satisfaction at hitting her quickly turned to unease. This wasn't how it usually went. People usually broke down when he got physical. They usually begged or cried or tried to run. But Dr. Richardson just stood there, radiating calm authority, making him look more and more like the out-of-control one. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," he threatened, trying to regain control of the situation. "On the contrary," Dr. Richardson replied, touching her cheek gently. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with. And you, Officer Barrett, have no idea who you just assaulted." She reached down and picked up her glasses, which thankfully weren't broken. As she put them back on, 2 more police cars pulled up to the scene, their lights flashing. Barrett smiled, expecting backup to help him put this woman in her place. But Dr. Richardson just pulled out her phone, finally making the call she'd been trying to make earlier. Her voice was clear and steady as she spoke. "Hello, Marcus? Yes, I'm going to be late to the hospital. Could you come to Oak Hills Drive right away? And honey, bring internal affairs with you." The 2 newly arrived police cars had barely stopped when Officers Chen and Rodriguez jumped out, quickly assessing the tense scene before them. The growing crowd of onlookers, phones raised high, the expensive Mercedes pulled over, and their colleague Officer Barrett standing uncomfortably close to a professionally dressed woman in a doctor's coat. It all painted a concerning picture. "What's the situation here?" Officer Chen asked, approaching cautiously. She had worked with Barrett before and knew about his reputation for being aggressive, especially during traffic stops. "This woman is resisting arrest," Barrett said quickly, trying to control the narrative. But his voice trembled slightly, something his fellow officers had never heard before. "I'm not resisting anything," Dr. Richardson spoke calmly, still holding her phone. "I'm waiting for Chief Richardson to arrive." She turned to the new officers, her composure unwavering despite the red mark still visible on her face. "Officers, I'd like to file a formal complaint against Officer Barrett for assault. As you can see, there are multiple witnesses and video evidence." Officer Rodriguez noticed the mark on her face and shot a sharp look at Barrett. "You struck her?" he asked in disbelief. Sarah Chen, the coffee shop owner, stepped forward bravely. "I have the whole thing on video," she announced. "He slapped her for no reason. She was just standing there, being polite." Other witnesses began speaking up too, their voices overlapping. "She didn't do anything wrong. He made up a story about a stop sign. We saw the whole thing." Barrett's face had turned an unhealthy shade of pale. She was reaching for something in her car. He tried to explain, but his voice sounded weak even to his own ears. "I was reaching for my phone. Dr. Richardson corrected him to call my husband, which I have now done. He should be here shortly with internal affairs." Officer Chen stepped between Barrett and Dr. Richardson. "Ma'am, are you okay? Do you need medical attention?" "I'm actually a doctor myself," Dr. Richardson replied with a small smile. "I'll be fine, though I will be documenting this injury for the official complaint." The sound of more sirens filled the air. Barrett's hands began to shake as he recognized the distinctive sound of the chief's vehicle. What had started as a routine traffic stop, one where he thought he could exercise his authority without consequences, was quickly spiraling out of his control. Officer Rodriguez had pulled Barrett aside. "What were you thinking?" he whispered harshly. "There are at least 20 people recording this. And did you say Chief Richardson is coming?" Before Barrett could respond, 3 more vehicles pulled up: the chief's car, an internal affairs car, and an unmarked police vehicle. The crowd parted as Chief Marcus Richardson stepped out, his face like thunder as he surveyed the scene. Dr. Richardson stayed where she was, maintaining her dignified stance. "Hello, honey," she said when the chief approached. "I'm sorry to interrupt your morning meeting." The chief gently touched the red mark on his wife's face, his jaw clenching with barely controlled anger. Then he turned to face Barrett, who looked like he might pass out. "Officer Barrett." Chief Richardson's voice was deadly quiet. "Would you care to explain why you put your hands on my wife?" Barrett's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The other officers had stepped back, creating distance between themselves and what they now recognized as a career-ending situation. Sarah Chen approached the chief, her phone extended. "Sir, I have the entire incident recorded, from the moment he pulled her over. There was no stop sign, and your wife was nothing but professional and polite." "Thank you." Chief Richardson nodded to her. "Internal Affairs will need a copy of that footage." He turned to the IA officers who had arrived with him. "I want statements from every witness. Officer Barrett's bodycam footage needs to be secured immediately." Dr. Richardson touched her husband's arm gently. "Marcus, I need to get to the hospital. I have patients waiting." "Rodriguez," Chief Richardson called. "Please provide my wife with an escort to Central Hospital." He turned back to Dr. Richardson. "We'll handle everything here, Michelle. I'll see you tonight." As Dr. Richardson walked back to her car with Officer Rodriguez, the crowd of witnesses began applauding. Barrett watched her leave, finally realizing that his entire career had just crashed down around him, all because he couldn't control his prejudices and his temper. An hour later, Officer Barrett sat alone in a small room at the police station, staring at the blank incident report form in front of him. His hands were shaking so badly that he could barely hold his pen. The events of the morning kept replaying in his mind like a horrible movie he couldn't stop. Outside the room, the station was buzzing with activity. News of what happened had spread like wildfire through the department. Officers walked past the room's window, some shaking their heads in disgust, others whispering among themselves. Barrett could feel their eyes on him, judging him, condemning him. "I can explain everything," he muttered to himself as he started writing. But as he tried to put his version of events on paper, nothing sounded right. How could he justify slapping an unarmed woman who had done nothing wrong? Even worse, how could he explain slapping the chief's wife? Sergeant Martinez knocked on the door and entered without waiting for a response. "Your bodycam footage is being reviewed right now," she informed him coldly. Internal Affairs wants it compared with the witness videos. Barrett's stomach turned. He had forgotten about his bodycam in the heat of the moment. "I want to speak to my union representative," he said weakly. "Oh, They're on their way, Martinez replied. But Barrett, I've got to tell you, I've seen the footage. There's nothing they can do for you this time. Just then, Officer Chen walked by with a USB drive. Got another witness video, she announced to Martinez. This one shows everything from the moment he made up the fake stop sign violation. Barrett put his head in his hands. He had done this so many times before, pulling people over without cause, using his badge to intimidate them, even getting physical sometimes. But those people had been afraid to report him, or their complaints had been ignored. This time was different. The chief wants to see you in his office. A stern voice came from the doorway. It was Lieutenant Rogers, and his face showed no sympathy. Now, Barrett stood up on shaky legs and followed Rogers through the station. Every eye was on him as he walked the longest 50 steps of his life to the chief's office. Some officers he considered friends quickly looked away when he passed. Others stared at him with open disgust. The chief's secretary, Mrs. Thompson, didn't even look up as they approached. "Go right in," she said coldly. "They're waiting for you." Barrett's heart nearly stopped. They? Who else was in there? As Rogers opened the door, Barrett saw that the chief's large office was full of people. Chief Richardson sat behind his desk, his face like stone. 2 internal affairs officers stood on one side of the room. The police union representative sat in a corner, looking uncomfortable. And most terrifyingly, the district attorney herself was there, reviewing papers with a grim expression. "Sit down, Officer Barrett." Chief Richardson's voice was frighteningly calm. "We have a lot to discuss." Barrett lowered himself into the chair facing the chief's desk. His legs felt like jelly. "Before we begin," the chief continued, pressing a button on his computer, "let's review your body cam footage together." The large screen on the wall came to life, showing Barrett's entire interaction with Dr. Richardson from his own perspective. After this, Chief Richardson said as the video started playing, "We'll watch the 12, yes, 12, witness videos that have been submitted. Then we'll discuss the 17 civilian complaints that have been filed against you over the past 3 years. Complaints that I'm only now learning were buried by your former sergeant, who, I should mention, is also under investigation." Barrett watched himself on the screen, seeing his actions through others' eyes for the first time. The way he strutted up to Dr. Richardson's car, his aggressive tone, his completely fabricated reason for the stop, it all looked so much worse than he remembered. But first, the chief's voice cut through Barrett's thoughts. "I want you to explain to everyone in this room why you thought it was acceptable to assault my wife." The room fell silent, all eyes turned to Barrett. The career he had abused for so long was about to come crashing down, and there was absolutely nothing he could do about it. Barrett's mouth felt dry as sandpaper as he sat in the chief's office, surrounded by stern faces. The bodycam footage had finished playing, showing his horrible behavior in crystal clear detail. Now, Chief Richardson stood up slowly, his tall frame casting a shadow over the desk. "Let me tell you about my wife, Officer Barrett," the chief began, his voice dangerously quiet. "Dr. Michelle Richardson graduated top of her class at Johns Hopkins Medical School. She saved more lives in 1 year than most people could in 10 lifetimes. She's the head of neurosurgery at Central Hospital, and she was on her way to perform life-saving surgery when you decided to harass her." Barrett shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He'd never seen the chief this angry, even though the man was speaking very calmly. "But you didn't see any of that, did you?" Chief Richardson continued. "You didn't see a respected doctor. You didn't see a loving wife. You didn't see a valued member of our community. What did you see, Barrett? Tell us all what you saw." The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. The internal affairs officers had their notebooks ready. The district attorney leaned forward, waiting for his response. I made a mistake," Barrett stammered. "A mistake?" The chief's voice rose slightly. "A mistake is filing the wrong paperwork. A mistake is being late for your shift. What you did was not a mistake, it was a deliberate choice. And now we're going to talk about all your other mistakes." The district attorney stepped forward, opening a thick folder. "Officer Barrett, we have here 17 previous complaints against you. All of them involve traffic stops. All of them involve minority drivers. All of them were mysteriously marked as resolved by your former sergeant." Barrett's face went pale. He thought those complaints had disappeared forever. "Sir," the union representative spoke up weakly, Perhaps we should discuss this in private. No. Chief Richardson cut him off. Nothing about this will be private. In fact, he pressed a button on his desk phone. Mrs. Thompson, please send in our other guests. The office door opened, and Barrett's heart nearly stopped. Sarah Chen, the coffee shop owner, walked in with her phone. Behind her came 3 other people Barrett recognized with horror, people he had harassed during previous traffic stops. These citizens, the chief explained, have been waiting to tell their stories for a long time. Ms. Chen's video of today's incident gave them the courage to come forward again. This time, their complaints won't be buried. One of the visitors, an elderly man with kind eyes, spoke up. He pushed me against my car last month when I was driving my grandchildren to school. I tried to report it, but nothing happened. He threatened to arrest me for asking why I was pulled over, added a young woman in nursing scrubs. I missed my shift at the hospital because he kept me for 2 hours for no reason. Barrett slumped in his chair as more stories poured out. Each one was like a nail in the coffin of his career. The district attorney cleared her throat. Based on the evidence we gathered just today, we're looking at multiple charges: assault, abuse of power, filing false reports, and civil rights violations. And as more victims come forward... Please, Barrett interrupted, his voice shaking. I have a family. I need this job. Chief Richardson's eyes flashed with anger. My wife has a family too. All these people you harassed have families. Did you think about their jobs, their lives, their safety when you were abusing your power? Suddenly, the chief's phone buzzed. He answered it, listened for a moment, then smiled coldly at Barrett. That was the hospital, he said. Dr. Richardson just finished her surgery successfully. A young mother will live to see her children grow up, no thanks to your interference this morning. Barrett felt tears running down his face as the full weight of his actions crashed down on him. All his years of bullying, all his abuse of power, all of his prejudices, everything was coming to light. And there, in the chief's office, surrounded by his victims and facing the consequences of his actions, Officer James Barrett finally broke down completely. By late afternoon, the news of Officer Barrett's actions had spread far beyond the police station. Local TV stations parked their vans outside, reporters clutching microphones as they waited for statements. Social media was buzzing with Sarah Chen's video, which had already reached over 1 million views. Inside the station, Barrett sat in the break room, his police badge and gun already surrendered. His hand shook as he read the suspension papers in front of him. The words, "immediate suspension without pay pending investigation," seemed to jump off the page. "Sign it," Lieutenant Rogers said firmly, standing over him. "It's either this, or you get arrested right now for assault. The chief is being more merciful than you deserve." As Barrett picked up the pen, he noticed his former colleagues packing up his desk in the main office. They were putting his things in a cardboard box, but nobody was being careful about it. His Officer of the Month award from 2 years ago fell into the trash can, and nobody bothered to pick it up. Officer Chen walked past, carrying a stack of files. "We found more complaints," she announced to Lieutenant Rogers. They were hidden in old storage boxes. "Looks like the cover-up goes back 5 years. Barrett's face crumpled. "Those were supposed to be destroyed," he whispered before he could stop himself. Rogers' eyes narrowed. "What did you just say?" He turned to Officer Chen. "Write that down. He just admitted to destroying evidence." In the chief's office, a different scene was unfolding. Dr. Richardson had arrived after finishing her surgeries, still wearing her hospital scrubs. She sat across from her husband, discussing not just Barrett's case, but the larger problems it revealed. "It's not just about him," she said thoughtfully. "Barrett is a symptom of a bigger problem. How many other complaints have been buried? How many other officers are out there doing the same things?" Chief Richardson nodded gravely. "I've already ordered a complete review of all complaint files going back 10 years. But Michelle, I need your help with something else." He showed her a proposal on his computer. It outlined a new civilian oversight committee, one that would review police conduct independently of the department. "I want you to lead it," he said. "Your experience today, combined with your standing in the community, makes you perfect for this role." Meanwhile, in the detective's office, Sarah Chen was showing more videos from her coffee shop's security cameras. "I've been recording Barrett's traffic stops for months," she explained. "My shop's cameras catch everything on that street, I just never had the courage to come forward before. But when I saw him hit Dr. Richardson, the detective nodded, downloading all the footage. You did the right thing, Ms. Chen. Your videos are going to help a lot of people get justice. Out in the main office, more of Barrett's victims were arriving to file official statements. The young nurse he had harassed was there, along with the elderly man and several others. They sat together, drawing strength from each other as they finally told their stories. Barrett watched them through the break room window, the enormity of his situation crushing him. His phone kept buzzing with messages. His wife asking what was going on, his children's school calling about picking them up, his mortgage company sending a payment reminder. His entire life was falling apart, and he had nobody to blame but himself. Barrett, an internal affairs officer, called from the doorway. The DA wants to see you now. She's offering a deal, but only if you help identify other officers involved in burying complaints. For the first time, Barrett faced a choice: protect the corrupt system he had been part of, or try to save himself by telling the truth. As he stood up on shaky legs, he caught a glimpse of Dr. Richardson in the chief's office. She was standing at the window, her face still showing the mark from his slap, but her expression was determined rather than vengeful. "I'll tell you everything," Barrett said quietly. "Every complaint that was buried, every officer who helped cover things up, every surgeon who looked the other way. It's time everyone knew the truth." 1 month after the incident, the police department's main conference room was packed with people. Dr. Michelle Richardson stood at the podium, addressing a crowd of officers, community leaders, and journalists. The mark on her face had long since faded, but the impact of that morning continued to grow. "Today," she announced, her voice clear and strong, "we're launching the Citizens Police Accountability Board. This independent committee will ensure that no complaint goes unheard and no officer's misconduct goes unchecked." In the back of the room, Sarah Chen sat with other community members who had helped expose Barrett's actions. Her coffee shop had become a symbol of community watchfulness, and business was booming as people came in to thank her for her bravery. Chief Richardson stood proudly beside his wife. The past month had been challenging for him, discovering just how deep the corruption in his department went. Barrett's confession had led to the suspension of 3 surgeons and an internal affairs officer, all of whom had helped bury complaints over the years. The board will include community members, legal experts, and civil rights advocates, Dr. Richardson continued. "We've also established a secure online system where citizens can file complaints directly, with automatic copying to multiple oversight agencies." In a small apartment across town, Barrett watched the press conference on TV. He looked different now, older, tired, wearing civilian clothes instead of his uniform. His wife sat beside him, still trying to process how their life had changed so dramatically. "Former Officer Barrett's cooperation has been crucial," Dr. Richardson said on screen, causing Barrett to flinch at the word former. His testimony revealed a pattern of misconduct that went far beyond one officer's actions. "Today, we're not just punishing individuals, we're changing the entire system." Back at the conference, Officer Chen raised her hand to speak. She had recently been promoted to lead a new training program. "We're implementing mandatory body camera reviews," she explained to the audience. "Every traffic stop, every interaction will be monitored. Officers will be required to explain their decisions if any patterns of bias emerge." The elderly man Barrett had harassed, Mr. Washington, was now a respected member of the new accountability board. He spoke next. "We're not here to punish good police officers. We're here to protect both the community and the officers who serve it properly. Trust goes both ways." In his apartment, Barrett turned off the TV. The DA's deal had saved him from jail time, but his career in law enforcement was over forever. His testimony against other corrupt officers had made him an outcast among his former friends. But as he looked at the family photos on his wall, he knew he had made the right choice, finally telling the truth. At the police academy across town, new cadets sat in a classroom, watching video footage of Barrett's interaction with Dr. Richardson. It had become part of the mandatory training on what not to do, along with lessons about implicit bias and proper use of authority. "Remember," their instructor said, "a badge is not a weapon. It's a symbol of public trust. And that trust must be earned every single day." Back at the conference, Dr. Richardson was wrapping up her speech. "Change isn't easy," she acknowledged, looking around the room, "but it's necessary. What happened to me was terrible, but if it helps prevent future abuse and creates real accountability, then some good will have come from it. Chief Richardson squeezed his wife's hand as she stepped down from the podium. Together, they had turned a moment of injustice into a movement for change. The department would never be the same. In her coffee shop that evening, Sarah Chen hung a framed newspaper article about the new accountability board. Under it, she placed a small sign that read, "Stand up for what's right, even if you're standing alone." The story of the evil cop who slapped the wrong woman had become more than just another viral video. It had become a catalyst for real change, a reminder that no one was above the law, and proof that standing up against injustice could make a difference. The power of the badge had finally met its match in the power of the people it was meant to serve. 6 months had passed since that fateful morning traffic stop. The autumn leaves fell gently outside Central Hospital as Dr. Michelle Richardson finished her rounds. Her phone buzzed with a news alert. Former Officer Barrett completes community service, speaks at police reform conference. She paused to read the article, remembering how one moment of confrontation had sparked such widespread change. The police department had transformed in ways nobody could have predicted. Over 50 buried complaints had been discovered and reviewed. 12 officers had been removed from duty, but more importantly, new policies had created real accountability. At Sarah Chen's coffee shop, which had become a popular community gathering spot, the morning crowd discussed the latest statistics. Complaints against officers had dropped by 70%. Traffic stop numbers showed no racial disparities for the first time in the department's history. Body camera footage was being reviewed weekly by the Civilian Oversight Board. "Dr. Richardson's here," someone called out as Michelle entered the coffee shop. People smiled and waved. She had become something of a local hero, though she never thought of herself that way. Sarah hurried over with Michelle's usual order. "Did you see the morning paper? They're implementing our oversight program in 3 other cities now." Michelle nodded, taking her coffee. Through the window, she could see a police car making a routine traffic stop. The officer was professional and respectful, their body camera clearly visible. The driver looked nervous at first but soon relaxed. This was how things should be. Across town, Barrett sat in his small office at the community center. After losing his badge, he had struggled to find his place. But eventually, he had started counseling other former officers, helping them understand and address their biases. It wasn't the life he had imagined, but it was a chance to make amends. His phone rang. It was his teenage daughter. "Dad, guess what? We're studying about civil rights in school, and they talked about what happened with Dr. Richardson. My teacher said it was a turning point for our city." Barrett felt the familiar mix of shame and hope that always came when people mentioned that day. "What did you tell your classmates?" he asked quietly. "I told them my dad made a terrible mistake," his daughter replied. "But then he helped fix the broken system. I told them people can change if they really want to." At the police academy, new recruits watched body camera videos from recent traffic stops, comparing them to footage from 6 months ago. The difference was striking. Officers were calmer, more professional. Citizens were more trusting. The atmosphere of fear and tension had been replaced by mutual respect. Chief Richardson sat in his office, reviewing the latest Oversight Board report with pride. His wife's leadership had helped create a model program that other cities were eager to copy. Next week, they would host police chiefs from 20 other departments, all wanting to learn from their experience. Michelle finished her coffee and headed back to the hospital. As she walked, Officer Chen drove by, waving from her patrol car. The young officer had recently been promoted to lead the department's new community relations unit. A local news crew was setting up outside the hospital. "Dr. Richardson," the reporter called out, "can we get a comment about the National Police Reform Bill that was inspired by your case?" Michelle smiled but shook her head. "Sorry, I have patients waiting. But you should talk to Mr. Washington and the other Oversight Board members. They're the ones doing the real work now." In the hospital lobby, she passed a framed newspaper article about that morning 6 months ago. Next to it hung a new sign that read, "One person standing up for justice can change a community. A community standing up for justice can change the world." As she headed to her next surgery, Michelle thought about how a horrible moment had led to positive change. Barrett's slap had been heard around the country, but the echoes had turned into something unexpected: hope, reform, and progress. The story wasn't just about an evil cop who slapped the wrong woman anymore. It had become a lesson about accountability, courage, and the power of turning pain into progress. In the end, justice had prevailed not through violence or revenge, but through systematic change and community action.